What kind of school is this anyway?
I can handle things, I'm smart.
Stupid is, stupid does, sir.
But have you considered that he might just be that good? Not this good.
Welcome to the MrIQ podcast. Here's your host, Chip Franklin.
The 1918 pandemic caused the global deaths of probably 50 and maybe up to 100 million people, making it the worst natural disaster in all of recorded human history.
That was 100 years ago, and it appears we've learned very little. Although the worldwide total will be far less than the Spanish flu, well, hopefully, as we struggle through COVID, the masks, the distancing, the vaccines, my questions are less about this pandemic, but future events.
Mataba is only spread through direct human contact. Now, you said that yourself, Sam.
I know what I told you, but now I'm telling you we're facing a new strain. It spreads like the flu.
Impossible.
Fine. Go to the hospital, check it out yourself. Go without a mask, you'll see more clearly.
That's from the movie Outbreak. And what makes SARS-CoV-2 different is it's not that deadly. But that's the real fear. What if SARS or MERS or another deadly virus had the transmissibility of this one? On my podcast with climate scientist Michael Mann, we spoke of climate change effects on every aspect of our lives, including pandemics, and it was both disconcerting and hopeful. The good news is a virus cannot live without a host, so hopefully it would never destroy all of the hosts, right? But the real hope is that we can understand the past, or in this case, the present, so we might just save the future. Professor Frank Snowden is a professor emeritus of history and history of medicine at Yale University. His previous books include The Conquest of Malaria and Naples in the Time of Cholera. His latest, though, is Epidemics and Society. And he's been kind enough to join me in this discussion. So, Professor, fundamentally, what is the difference between this pandemic and the Spanish flu of 1918?
Actually, I think they're really fundamentally different. It seems to many people as though the Spanish influenza is a sort of predecessor and that we should look to it for the lessons that we need to learn to apply this time around. But I think that's terribly misleading because the Spanish influenza was actually driven by total warfare. And if you ask when the Spanish influenza would end, well, the answer would be when the war ended. That does not apply at all, thank God, to COVID-19, which is in fact not driven in any similar way. It's the product of globalization and all that implies in terms of intense interconnectivity, and that didn't exist in 1918. There wasn't a world market yet. There was not the internet. There was very little tourism. The first intercontinental flight had yet a couple of decades to go before it took off. So it was a world that was much less in population, much less. We have COVID-19 in large part because of climate change and our destruction of the environment and the extraordinary density of our population as we approach 8 billion people in the world. Soon they'll be standing room only. So I believe that the lessons then for COVID-19 are very different, that what we have to do is it's not going to end in any automatic way. It's really something that we have to do what Joshua Lederberg said long ago, our great resource in the competition with microbes, since they're infinitely numerous and infinitely capable of mutating. In fact, that's what viruses do best. What we need to apply is our intelligence. And I would add, I assume that to mean science, and that we need also the ability to collaborate and cooperate, because being a product of globalization, we're all in this in the world together.
Wow.
And anything that affects Botswana in the morning will affect the rest of us by the evening. So I think it's fundamentally different.
I quote Mark Twain a lot in his famous saying that the United States' two greatest defenses were the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but that doesn't apply anymore, obviously.
They're highways rather than fences.
There you go. It's interesting. We don't really know the origins. We hear wet market, and I've heard people talk about, did it jump out of the Virology Institute in Wuhan? But also looking back to the Spanish flu, which was, of course, maybe you explain that it didn't originate in Spain. In fact, the name was unfairly given to them. Could you comment on that? And also maybe the origins of the 1918. Did it really maybe start in Kansas? Or did it come over from?
That's interesting that you ask that. The origins, as you said, the name is simply because Spain was a non-belligerent country, and the countries that were engaged in the war didn't want enemy countries to know what factors might be affecting their morale and their ability to deploy troops and resources. So they censored and self-censored the press, and Spain had a free press, so people associated the war with Spain. Actually, it started, and there are three candidates for where it started, of which the most probable seemed to me one, the Kansas variant that you mentioned, and the other, Professor John Oxford in Britain argues quite persuasively it may have originated in a spillover event or series of spillover events in France. At the great military base at Étaples.
Really?
Yes, and that was a place where birds migrated near, and it was a place where you had these 100,000 young men, and also they had lots of pigs. That they were future food for the 100,000 young men living in terrible conditions, and many of them fresh from the trenches and passing through lots of people that way. And so it was an ideal environment for migrating birds to pass on the microbe, perhaps to the pigs, perhaps directly to the people. One doesn't know. Or else something similar happened in Camp Funston in Kansas. And those are the two most, I think, reasonable ideas of how it got to us.
Interesting. So when you say, so there were like swine, and in this other particular case, we're talking about possible bats. How does that jump actually occur? I read something not long ago how SARS-CoV-2 may have been around for a couple of years, and it had been making that jump before. It wasn't successful in our body at being able to penetrate the cells and at that receptor site. Is there evidence, number one, explain to me just how it does. Does it the proximity, or do you have to actually eat the animal? How does the virus get into a human?
Right. And that, too, is something that's being investigated as we speak. In fact, the WHO team is now looking into the origins that way. And it seems that this is largely a factor. There's nothing wrong with the bats. They happen to be reservoirs of thousands of different coronaviruses, so they are important from a health point of view in that way. But nothing bad happens until humans do bad things to bats by invading their habitat, destroying it, and driving them closer to human settlements and human farming. The spillover, one of the things that's being discussed is whether it happened directly from bats to humans, perhaps through dietary preferences for, we call it bushmeat if it's not what we're used to. We call it game if it's the animals that we like to eat and they're not used to. But in any case, it could be, or from the hunters dealing with the animals, or another possibility is that it was brought, bats were often brought to the wet market in Wuhan, and there they were in cages in terribly unsanitary conditions where their droppings fell upon other animals, and people think it may well have infected pangolins as an intermediate host, which was also much prized in the Huanan market. And so whether this was from a pangolin indirectly or from a bat directly, it's clear that it does come from bats, and that there, as you said, this was not a first time ever, that this had been a sort of ongoing process, but it was on these occasions in December or late November possibly of 2019 that we were very, very unlucky as a species. And it then spread from the Huanan market to the very crowded and congested urban city of Wuhan all around it, a perfect sort of environment for an airborne pulmonary virus to take off. And that's exactly what it did. But there's one thing that's clear didn't happen. It was not released from a Chinese laboratory, nor was it an act of bioterrorism. And the genetic sequencing has made that conclusively clear.
Yeah, I've read that. I saw some people on Bill Maher's show the other night. They had written a book. Two well-known virologists and infectious disease specialists. One was an infectious disease specialist, and they made the case that it might have been thrown out in the trash or something from the Virology Institute. That it wasn't bioengineered, as you just said. I haven't heard a lot of evidence to that point, and I think that it's something that Tom Cotton and President Trump and some others like to propagate because it made it seem less like we screwed up. But let me ask you this, though. The idea, though, that back in 2018, we sent some people down from our Beijing embassy to visit the Wuhan Virology Institute, and they were appalled by what they saw, that they weren't actually they didn't have the equipment and the personnel and some of what the science that they needed, and they cabled back to the U.S. Embassy saying, "We need to help these guys." It was never followed through. What could we have done to help them with this? I mean, we've known about this, right? I mean, I don't know how many centuries. There's two questions here. So, what could we have done? And also, let's go backwards. How long have we seen these? Is it called zoonotic? Is that the word? Am I getting that right? Okay. How long have we seen these jumps from animals to human? Does that go way back in human history?
Oh, absolutely. It goes way back in human history. And that's clearly, we know that that's how bubonic plague also comes from animal reservoirs. So from the bubonic plague to the present, there have been these zoonotic leaps. What is clear, however, and is more threatening, is that the rate at which this happens is increasing. So and that has to do with our vast explosion of population and our invasion and through our economy, which is also, we seem to have the view that we can expand infinitely without penalty, but that while we're doing that, we're deforesting the world and we're driving wild animals, we're destroying biodiversity and driving our wild animals much closer into very frequent contact. And so many diseases, HIV, AIDS, Ebola, swine flu, etc., MERS, SARS, are all zoonotic diseases, and Lyme disease, etc. So yes, these are zoonotic diseases are a great risk of our times, and that's not by chance. That it's because of the kind of society we've created.
We know now about the sobering aspects of this. We're closer together. You mentioned climate change. I had Michael Mann on. I interviewed him recently, and he has a book called Climate Wars, and I was talking about this, and he's much more optimistic than a lot of the people I've read. But I mean, can we continue doing what we've done since the Industrial Revolution without some cataclysmic result? I mean, we know viruses generally don't kill all their hosts, otherwise they have no place to live. But what if we get that perfect storm? If we get like a SARS or a MERS, and we get this kind of transmissibility that COVID-19 has?
There's no reason in principle that couldn't happen. And here I'm not preaching the apocalypse, which is something I'm neither predicting nor expecting, and definitely hoping against hope will never happen. But vulnerability is a different matter. And I think we're immensely vulnerable in the manner that you're just talking about to these viral diseases. That's because we have created the conditions which they reach people, and we've created a wonderful environment in which they can thrive in our mega cities, and in particularly also in poverty, the pollution in the air that makes people also vulnerable. And then we have mass tourism, mass trade, mass investment that link us all together. So those are all avenues that we, as a society, have created. The good news is that since we've created those pathways, that, as you say, the virus has no agency. It merely creates avenues that we create. If we've created those pathways, we can also prevent them using them. And so this is a call then to action, not going back to exactly the world in which we lived before COVID-19, because as you were suggesting, there's a penalty for what we've done to the planet. And the penalty is that we now have a situation that simply isn't sustainable. And that doesn't mean we all have to throw up our hands and despair. It means that we have to use our heads and cooperate together as a world to try to make certain that we change our way of life in certain very fundamental ways. Our relationship with the environment and deforestation, our relationship with climate change, our relationship with each other in terms of ever-growing poverty and inequality. And also we need to post sentinels. We know where we're vulnerable, the potential hotspots are likely to be. And there can be sentinels posted checking to see if these spillover events are actually occurring and be ahead of the curve when they do. So I don't think we need to be filled with despair. It's the opposite. We need to resolve that this is something that we can do something about. Science and the history of public health have provided us with very usable, workable tools and insights. And shame on us if we're again as vulnerable in the future as we were this time, because we shouldn't have been vulnerable this time.
We're talking to Professor Frank Snowden and his book, Epidemics in Society, which chronicles, I think, man as much as it does the virus. Let me ask you a question. If you had known what we know right now back in March of 2020, what would you have recommended in terms of epidemiological solutions and international tension?
Well, in terms of epidemiological solutions, I would certainly have recommended very vigorous application of the instruments that were invented in the Renaissance to deal with bubonic plague, and that were also effective when they were applied against the Spanish influenza. And those have to do with social distancing, banning of mass congregate gatherings, the vigorous hand hygiene, the wearing of face masks, the closing of those bars and restaurants that are super spreader possibilities for the disease. So there was large numbers of epidemiological interventions that we know to be effective, have proven to be effective, and that unfortunately we haven't been willing to sustain, and we've been divided about them in our country, as in many others. It's not just an American affliction, but...
So it's politics. I mean, if Trump had this ability, which he doesn't, back in March to say, wear a mask and be a hero. We're going to make these masks. We're going to write hero on them. And you wear a mask and you save lives. Turn it into a macho thing. We don't seem to really understand. 500,000 deaths later, we're still not really fully getting a grip on this. And I mean, part of me thinks that a representative democracy has a hard time getting through like this because there's too many chefs. I mean, if we had one leader who had the kind of, like with Trump, he had this mandate with his people. I mean, if he had come out and said this, I have no doubt that we could have seen different numbers. Or if we'd shut down, what if we'd shut down the country for 30 days, like in April? Could that have had an effect?
That would have had a huge effect. And it's a tragedy that this was politically impossible, because it would have saved so many of those lives and those infections. And it would also, perhaps, one reason we didn't do it was the short-sighted view that, this would be bad for our economy. Actually, what we did in not closing down was much worse, as we're seeing, and extends the disease, plus hurts the economy. But there's something else it does, which is that it allows much more opportunity opportunity for the virus to mutate. And that's one of the reasons we ourselves as a society have actually generated a lot of the opportunity for the disease to produce these different variants that are now much more problematic to control. So it was failure to do that that also drove the disease in ways that make it much more difficult to manage. So yes, we needed that sort of leadership. And I don't think it's a matter of democracy versus authoritarianism, because there have been democratic societies that, compared with our country, have been absolute models. I mean, think of Taiwan or South
Japan.
Korea. Japan, Iceland. Denmark. These are democracies that did infinitely better than we've been able to do, sadly.
Viruses mutate and they change. They become less lethal, it seems, over time. And we don't have that kind of growth because things change. HIV was a great example. We changed our behavior and we were able to, even though we couldn't create a vaccine, now through these antiviral cocktails, we can slow the growth and even stop the spread of HIV. I wonder here in the United States with so many millions of people and this idea of freedom being it's such a core, like you can't tell me what to do. I have these freedoms. You can't take them away. That seems to be the heart of this resistance. How do you get that message to people? And the reason I bring it back 100 years ago, we could do things that you can't do today because of social media and because of groups that are really good at spreading this anti-authoritarian propaganda. I see the greatest problem with future pandemics is not the virus, but us.
Yes, well, I agree entirely with that. And I had the advantage, if I want to put it that way, of living in Italy during the time when it was the epicenter of the pandemic. I even had the advantage, if we want to call that, of catching COVID-19 as
Did
well.
you?
Yes, I did. And I was lucky. I had a mild case. But this really did provide me with an entree to understanding. And one of the things related to what you're saying precisely was then the ability to contrast what Italy did in terms of messaging that we utterly failed to do. I don't want to mythologize the Italian response. I have criticisms and so as well. But they, as soon as they announced a national lockdown, something we never did, the Prime Minister went on the television and he explained the reasons, and it was the only weapons we had to deal with coronavirus. So if we wanted to save the country, so appealing to patriotism, if we want to save ourselves, appealing to individualism, if we want to save our families, the neighborhoods in which we live, this is the only way we have to do it. There is no alternative. And so this is what we're going to do, and we're going to be held accountable for the results. It's for a limited period of time. The law would need to be repassed if we were to have any extension. And in the meantime, they had one message, and all of the different parties coalesced around this one goal. And throughout, and they were surrounded with public health officials and physicians. And this message was repeated, and there was constantly, and there were posters all over the city, and vans went through the streets saying, you really need to stay at home because this is our survival. And that, I think, was a really powerful message when it comes with one voice, unlike the United States, which did the opposite, which is it had sometimes no voice, and at other times the White House and its advisors disagreed, and then the 50 states, and within the states, the municipalities, and then the school boards within them. And so it was this great cacophony of just conflicting sound and noise. And that's exactly what generates this distrust of the state. I think it wasn't just our individualism, it's this capacity, which is abroad as well as in the United States, that's stimulated by the response that we had. Who would have trusted did anyone during our response, because we weren't being told the truth at any stage. And the government didn't treat us as adult human beings who need to know the truth, and public health can't act on the basis of lies and half-truths. They need real information in real time, and that was withheld. So we were in a terrible result. I guess I would say yes, as part of our human nature, but where our human nature is divided, and this appealed only to the dark side of us and never to the bright side.
So there is a bright side to this, and I think it's international cooperation, which I've seen. You know, I just finished a biography of Isaac Newton, and I love this line where Newton said, "If I accomplished anything, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants," referring to, you know, Tycho and Kepler and Copernicus and Galileo and others. And I think this is a real opportunity for world leaders to embrace science. I mean, we've always seen this problem with politicians and religious leaders and science, right? It threatens them because they can't understand it. You can't see microbes and all these other great scientists that had to overcome this problem with ignorance is too strong a word, but just lack of availability to knowledge and information. Although you can't say that today. I mean, I can go on YouTube and watch how heart surgery happens, right? So Dr. Snowden, let me ask you, So, Professor Snowden, let me ask you this. In regards to the next pandemic, what is the nightmare scenario that keeps you up at night?
My greatest worry, I suppose, is that we learn nothing from this experience, and we find ourselves not utterly decimated by COVID-19. But this isn't the last time, unless we do things, that we'll have a challenge. And we may have a challenge by a virus that, as you said, is as transmissible as COVID-19, but as lethal as Ebola, who knows? And that would be, but that would be because we as a world, as a species, we refuse to learn the lessons of this experience. And the lesson, it seems to me, has to begin in our minds and our hearts, which is that we need to change the way we do our business. We need to learn to think collectively as a world and to take measures to defend ourselves collectively and to follow science as we do so. If what we can't afford to do is don't misunderstand me. I am the opposite of an anti-vaxxer. I've had the vaccine myself. I recommend it to everyone. It's a fantastic discovery of science and so rapidly developed. And it's a wonderful tool, the vaccine. So I'm entirely in favor of it. But I think we need to remember that it's just a tool. It's not a panacea, and that with tools we need firefighters when there's a conflagration, and we need all of them, maybe more. But the point is that's not as important in the long run as what we've also learned to do, which is try to remove the causes of fire, regulating and inspecting electrical systems and so on. We need to do that with regard to epidemic diseases as well. And so if we think that we can just find a quick technological fix, we're going to have learned nothing. And then it's very sad that people say, I can't wait till we can go back to normal, meaning what was before. I can't wait till the COVID has been mastered. But to do that, we can't go back to what was before, not only because it's impossible, but also because it's not desirable, because that was the world that got us where we are at this moment. And that will get us into an even worse possibility with even more lethal and transmissible viruses in the future. So we need to learn that we need to reform those parts of the world, our society, and the way we do our business that's actually not sustainable and very dangerous. So,
I totally get it. I mean, being a parent forced me to be more optimistic than I'd ever been in my life when my children were born. I think the interesting thing about speaking with you, and it makes me feel good, is that you are optimistic, that your pushback on me and not needing some strong authoritarian rule, that we can figure this out ourselves. And, maybe Plato wasn't right after all. Maybe, we don't need a guardian class. Maybe we can all figure this out without having to elevate people to that role. Maybe we can all take part in that. And that's the ultimate solution.
Yes, can't we appreciate the beauty of your quote from Newton? And the fact is that democracies have a great advantage because if you think about it, science is the most democratic of all intellectual pursuits. No one claims authority in science. It's something where every person's idea is only as good as the proof that the person can produce and convince everyone else that if they did the same experiment, they'd end up with the same result. So I definitely think that authoritarian regimes are inimical to science, which is all about free inquiry. And so I think democracies are something that is good for our health, and I think dictators are bad for our health.
Thank you so much, Professor Snowden. Really great stuff. Please stay well, and I'm glad you're feeling better. So you're no long hauler after effects of your COVID?
Actually, I am a long hauler. I had the fatigue afterwards for 6 months. But it's now lifting and I'm becoming normal. But I now realize that I'm one of millions and millions who have that sort of after effect.
Please keep writing because we need to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Mr. IQ podcast with Chip Franklin. To hear more, go to MrIQ.com or wherever you download your podcasts.